All right, welcome back everybody to Soul Detox. Over the next few weeks, we're actually in a series called Fear Factor, how to conquer your fears and anxieties. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rajiv Khatri. I was born and raised in the US as a Hindu and had a very powerful encounter where God began to speak to me through visions. He began to communicate to me and reveal himself to me through this way. And this really gave me a deep passion, a deep desire to begin to share all that I've learned and all that I've experienced and that I continue to experience with those that want to hear about it. And while each week all of my teachings focus on the teachings of Jesus, it doesn't matter what faith background you come from. Everything I share is practical and relevant for everyone. Whether you come from a Christian background or a Hindu background, Muslim, Buddhist, atheist, whatever background you come from, everything I share is practical and relevant for everyone. Now, last week, we actually dove into what it means to have an anxious heart. And we learned that the wall of fear is an advertisement to God's greatest blessings. Okay, the wall of fear is an advertisement to God's greatest blessings. But what about failure? What about the fear of failure? And maybe some of you are thinking, well, I don't really have a fear of failure. I don't really think I have a fear of failure. So let me actually flip it around a bit, because maybe some of you think about it this way. Maybe some of you think about it like, well, why does he or she do so well? Why did they succeed and I don't? What makes high achievers excel? Why do some people fly high while others just plummet to the bottom? Is it luck? Is it blessing? Is it that golden touch? What makes the difference? Why do some people achieve so much? Is it family background? Well, having a good family background is definitely something to be grateful for. We should be grateful for that, and it could help. But I think many of us know that there are lots of successful people around the world that actually come from broken homes. Is it existing wealth? Well, another example, I think we can think of many people, especially here in India, where they've grown up with exorbitant amounts of money, a large amount of wealth, and as they grew older, they ended up squandering it. And then with the rise of India's entrepreneurs, especially in Bangalore, we see so many people, young people, rising up to success who didn't have wealthy backgrounds. So no, I don't think these could be any indicators to why certain achievers excel so well. Studies show that the difference between average people and achieving people is their perception of and their response to failure. I'm going to repeat that for you guys, okay? The difference between average people and achieving people is their perception of and their response to failure. When I was in grade school, when I was from first grade through 8th grade, I was an overachiever. I studied all day, every day, all the time, and I was a straight A student. For me, failure was not an option. Failure was just not an option for me to even look at. So I always focused on my studies. When I got into high school, however, new distractions started to come my way. I mean, really only two distractions: partying and girls. But because of that, my studies started to suffer. I started to bring home, a few bad grades here and there. I remember the first time I came home with my first bad grade, and I had to show my parents this. I was so nervous. I come home, with this test that I had, and I hand it over to my parents, and I flip it over for them to see, and it was a B. It was a B. And I know some of you are thinking, oh, a B, really? That's not that bad. But man, I was disappointed in myself. And my parents were actually pretty disappointed. And it wasn't far along before I started to bring home, a C every now and then, and a few D's here and there. And then that one day when I brought an F home on one of my tests. You see, these became very disappointing moments in my life. These became very, very heart-wrenching moments. I really took these things, internally, took them really hard inside. And what made it worse was seeing how disappointed my parents also became. This made it even more difficult. And very quickly, this view of failure started to go towards shame. I felt like if I fail, then I failed my family. And without realizing it, this failure that once led to shame suddenly became my identity. It was no longer the fact that I failed. It was now I'm a failure. And this view of failure, it crippled me. And in the back of my mind, I would always say things like, you're a loser. You're no good. You don't deserve this. You don't deserve anything. You don't deserve to be here. You're a failure. And I know we all go through moments like this. I think we all go through points in our lives where we feel like we've failed, or we feel like we're a failure at times. What if I fail in my business or my job? What if I fail at school? What if I fail in a relationship? What if I fail in controlling my emotions? What if I fail as a child to my parents? What if I always remain a failure because that's just who I am? You see, but how we're perceiving and how we're responding to failure, I think that's where many of us, we've got it wrong. We've got this part wrong. I think many of us have an unrealistic view of success and failure. In Leadership Magazine, there's a gentleman, J. Wallace Hamilton. He states this. He says the increase of suicides, alcoholics, and even some form of nervous breakdowns is evidence that many people are training for success when they should be training for failure. Failure is far more common than success. Poverty is more prevalent than wealth. Disappointment more normal than arrival. We need to be training for failure. That's so counterintuitive, but think about that. That's actually a great concept. And that's really what today's talk is all about. I really want you to learn how to confidently look failure straight in the eye. Look failure straight in the eye and move forward anyways. Now, here's the first thing I want you all to know. Here's the first thing, and I know for some of you, this is going to be hard to swallow. It's going to be hard to accept. Okay, but I want you to hear this because this is going to be very enlightening for some of you. Okay, this is going to be very eye-opening for some of you. So I really want you to hear this. You will fail. You will fail. We all do. We all fail. Realize this reality. And when you fail, it is okay to feel the disappointment. It's okay to do that. It's okay to feel the disappointment when you fail, but not disapproval. God still loves you even when you fail. Just because you failed at something doesn't make you a failure. Just because you failed financially or in a relationship or failed in school doesn't make you a failure. You need to get this first point. You need to embrace this next thought. You need to really hone in on this and own this reality, okay? Because one thing for many of you, this next point could be integral for the transformation that you're looking for in your life to actually occur. You need to realize that failure is an event, not a person. Failure is an event, not a person. Failure is an event and it's part of the process, but it's not your identity. And to take it even a step further, okay, there are times where God will allow us to fail because He knows that through that failure, He can do something in us and through us that He couldn't have otherwise done. And that's because failures are stepping stones to God's greatest success for you. Failures are oftentimes stepping stones to God's greatest success for you. And there are a number of people, recorded in history and recorded in scriptures who went through multiple failures. And we see time and time again, God use those failures that to us may seem like setbacks, but God uses them as huge setups for what He wanted to do in and through them, through that person's life. And many times we may experience, setbacks or failures or through circumstances that are maybe beyond our control. In fact, we have a recorded history of a man named Joseph. Now, Joseph lived in 1750 BC in an area called Canaan. Now, to give you some context and some understanding geographically, Canaan today is part of the southern half of an area called Levant, which is part of the Middle East. It's surrounded by the Taurus Mountains, the Mediterranean Sea, and part of the Arabian Desert. Right now, it surrounds places like Israel, Jordan, certain Palestinian territories like the West Bank and Gaza. It's even covering and surrounding southern parts of Syria and Lebanon. Okay, so that today is what Canaan is. Now, this guy Joseph, he would receive dreams from God. And in these dreams, God is actually showing him how he's going to elevate him. Elevate him among his brothers, elevate him above his parents, elevate him above a nation. And he would share these dreams with his family with such pride and arrogance. Well, that caused his brothers to get very jealous and very angry at him. So much so that they actually made plans to kill him. They made plans to kill his own brother. Their own brother. I mean, some of us are probably thinking, well, that sounds just crazy. Now, don't worry. They did have a change of heart, a slight change of heart. Their conscience started to kick in a little bit. And they decided, you know what? Let's not kill him. Instead, let's sell him. Let's sell him as a slave to the Egyptians. So they did that. They sold him as a slave to the Egyptians. They go back to their dad and say, Dad, we can't understand it. We don't know what happened, but it seems like a wild animal killed our brother. So they made their parents, think that their younger brother was now dead. Now, life for Joseph didn't get any easier after that. He experienced many hardships and failings in life. In fact, the wife of Potiphar. Now, Potiphar was an officer to the Pharaoh of Egypt. So this wife was so stricken by how handsome Joseph was. I mean, Joseph was a stud. He was a stud, and they were just taken back by him. And so much so that she started pursuing him to try and get him to sleep with her. Kind of a flip on that one, right? So she's trying to get him to sleep with her. He refuses. He refuses to do so. And she gets so upset that she falsely accuses him of rape. And then through that gets thrown into prison. I mean, talk about a string of horrible luck, a string of horrible failures. I mean, first his brothers sell him off as a slave to the Egyptians. Then he does the right thing by not sleeping with a married woman, gets falsely accused of rape, and then gets thrown into prison. I mean, I think many of us at this point in our life, we would be in a place where we're defeated, we're going to just give up. There's no point to go on with this. But not Joseph. Now, Joseph didn't do that. He had faith. He had faith and trust in the fact that God had a greater success story for him, a greater success plan for him, and that all these different hardships, all these different failings were just part of the process. God uses failure to prepare us, to shape us for our greater success. When you begin to look at some of the most successful individuals of our time, you'll find that every area of success had behind it a series of failings that led up to that success. When we look at Joseph's story, when we look at how Joseph's story ends, we see that God uses failures as stepping stones for the greatest success plan that Joseph had. God gave Joseph the opportunity and the ability to interpret dreams that the Pharaoh had. And these dreams were actually prophesying or telling the future about Egypt. And it was talking about a future famine that Egypt will have experienced. It was actually the worst famine that Egypt has ever experienced, even to this date. And then God gave Joseph wisdom on what needed to happen, what he needed to do to protect the people from this. So what ends up happening as a result of that is the Pharaoh decides to elevate Joseph to basically prime minister over all of Egypt. And from that, Joseph was able to implement the strategies that God gave him wisdom over to now protect so many people, saving so many lives, including his own families. Even the brothers who once betrayed him. That was what God was doing through him. God elevated Joseph among the people. God's greatest success plan for him was to elevate Joseph in this time period. God's path for you, his plan for your life, it isn't going to change. But But you need to be prepared. You need to be equipped. You need to be ready for that greater success that he has for you. Failures are part of that process. Failures are stepping stones to God's greatest success for you. So you don't have to be afraid of it. You don't have to be afraid of failure. If anything, you kind of embrace failure, because each failure is actually many successes leading up to the greater success God has for you. It enables you to walk into God's destiny for your life. This reminds me of a story. There's a woman, Mary Kay Ash. This is a woman who looked failure dead in the eye, and she moved forward anyways. This woman viewed failures as God's stepping stones to her greater success. Now, Mary Kay built a cosmetics company, as I'm sure many of you have heard of in the past. But before she built that business, she overcame a lot of obstacles. Her first career was in direct sales, and she was fairly successful at it. But she still had a very challenging time, a lot of difficulties moving up the corporate ladder as a woman in the 1950s and 60s. Now, and that's even though she had a 25-year track record of success. She had a 25-year track record, yet she still had challenging times moving up. Eventually, she did get promoted to be part of a board member of this corporate company. So she was now elevated to be a board member. This company had a direct sales force which was comprised of all women. All women, direct sales force. The board team, the people who actually led and governed the company, were all males. So you bring up this woman onto the board and you assume that, okay, this woman is going to give us insights, she's going to give us thoughts and views and opinions that'll help us to create a far more effective, far more productive sales team. Yet every time she spoke, every time she gave her thought and view and opinion, the guys on the board, the men on the board, they didn't value it. In fact, they would make comments saying, Mary, there you go, thinking like a woman again. This caused her to feel very rejected, which actually caused her to decide to retire. Fortunately, her retirement didn't last very long, only about a month. She decided to start her own business, a cosmetics company. But it wasn't before long that she started to encounter her first obstacles, even in that. She visited her attorney to make legal arrangements for her company. And as she was doing that, her attorney had no problem sharing his predictions on where this business was going to go. He started making comments how this business is going to fail, it's not going to do well. She even said a comment, Mary, if you're going to just throw your money away, why don't you go walk over to my trash can and just dump it there for me? It'd be much easier if you did it that way. And she wouldn't get this just from her attorney. She would get it from her accountant and all these other people that are supposed to support and help her business. But they're all giving her these concerns that they have. So for her, she had the prospect of failure in front of her. She could see the prospect of failure. And she moved forward anyways. She took all of her life savings, at the time $5,000, and dumped it into this business. She made her husband help her on the administrative side for the company. She focused on designing and developing the products, and about a month before they were going to launch and open the business, about a month before, all the excitement raring for them, her husband dies after a heart attack at their kitchen table. Now, most people, they wouldn't have been able to keep going after that. They would have come to a moment where they just accept defeat, they accept failure, and they just quit. But Mary Kay kept going. She kept going, and on September 13th, 1963, she launched her business. Today, the company has annual sales over $1 billion. It employs 3,500 people, has 500,000 direct sales consultants in 29 worldwide markets. Mary Kay, she's won almost every entrepreneurship award that's out there. Despite difficult circumstances, despite the hardships and the obstacles, what Mary did is she failed forward. She failed forward. She perceived and responded to failure, knowing that failure is a part of progress towards God's greatest success for you. In a historical letter to Romans, God even tells us that we too can rejoice when we run into problems and trials, for we know they help us develop endurance. Failures are actually good for us. They're doing something inside us. They're growing us. They're shaping us. They're building our character. They're increasing our knowledge and wisdom. They're increasing our clarity to become more and more in tune with God's plan for our lives. Now, oftentimes that plan, that greatest success, well, God's view of success, more often than not, is very different from our view of success. We often look at success as reaching the goal, hitting that target, hitting those revenue numbers that we were striving for, acing that exam that we were preparing for, all these different result-oriented, goals that we set out for. But God doesn't just look at the outcome. He's actually looking at more than that. He's looking at the inward growth of the person. Often our failures grow us far more than our successes. It's in our failures that God builds our character to prepare us for that greatest success that He has in store for us. And I want to share something else. Sometimes the greater success that God has in store for you, the bigger the failures that precede it. I know that may sound a little discouraging, but it's actually meant to be encouraging. Because if God has a big vision for your life, if He's got a big purpose for your life, a big calling for your life, He's got a big, quote-unquote, success plan for your life, understand that there's probably going to be a lot of big failures that you're going to go through that's preparing you, that's building you, that's equipping you for that big plan, that big call, that big purpose He has in store for you. Let me illustrate it another way. How many of you are mountain climbers? Any of you? Oh, some of you. Okay, that's good. That's good. I'm not a mountain climber, so don't judge me if I get any of these facts wrong. But if you were to climb a mountain like Mount Everest, you can't just go straight to climbing Mount Everest. I mean, Mount Everest, I think Everest's elevation is about, over 8,000 meters or so. I mean, our city is probably about, 920 meters? So very measly elevation compared to Mount Everest. And you can't go at it, straight away. You've got to take it slowly. You've got to reach that altitude slowly. It takes months, if not years, to prepare to go up that high. And in that process, you maybe even go back and think, this is way too hard, this is too challenging, this is too difficult. But each time you do it, each time you train for it, your body adjusts. Your body becomes stronger and stronger. Your levels increase, and you're able to go further and further up the climb. But if you went straight to the top, you'd suffer things like altitude poisoning. You wouldn't be able to handle the terrain or the weather conditions. You could just end up dying if you're not prepared, if you didn't equip yourself ahead of time, if you didn't go through the learning curves ahead of time. God works with us in a very similar way. It's because God loves us and knows what's best for us, that He doesn't want to allow us to experience, that greatest success too early in our life. Let me think about it. Many young people who become famous or extremely successful very quickly, they usually end up having lives that just fall apart. They fall to, this crashing of a life. Even in other parts of the world, they have the lottery system. And more often than not, people who win the lottery, they hit this success and they hit this wealth so fast that they actually fall to total ruin. It's because they weren't prepared on how to even handle that sort of wealth ahead of time. We even have child actors that grow up and start to abuse drugs, or in some cases even divorce their parents. I think we all know who that one is, the Home Alone character of Macaulay Culkin. So these crazy things start to happen when you hit success or wealth or whatever it may be too early. Now, I'm not saying young people can't experience success. Many young people do. But what I am saying is our quest for success is always paved with many failures along the way. Regardless of age, God uses failures for our good. When you look back from the top of the mountain, what do you see? You see the valleys and the hills. You see all the terrain that you went through, all the rough trenches that you walked through to get to the current hill you're at today. And that's probably the case right now. You're probably just on another one of those hills. Because you see, God's greatest success for you is still in store. The best is yet to come. We do get to experience the highs and lows. And each little mountaintop gives us more and more strength to reach that next high peak in our life. But when we're in those valleys, we can rest assured with the fact that God's with us and He's using that time to grow us, to prepare us, to equip us, to build our character for that greatest success that He has in store for us. I believe that God may be calling you to succeed in certain areas of your life, but you haven't been able to because you've got this fear of failure, this wall of failure that's coming in between you and that success that God has in store for you, that God's calling you for. You need to begin to view failure through God's eyes. Each failure in our life has a positive outcome and builds us in some way. Failure can become crippling if you allow it. Even the fear of failure can cripple you and paralyze you from moving forward. But if we begin to look at failure as stepping stones to something greater, we can move forward with confidence that God has our best in mind and that the best is yet to come. It's funny, sometimes I know in my own past, in my own life, I'll set out, to achieve certain things. But far more often than not, what ends up happening is what I end up achieving in life is very different from what I first set out to achieve. It's funny, sometimes I think back in my own life, in my own past, and it's very different because, the successes that I've experienced in my life are usually very different from what I first set out to achieve. God's idea of our greatest success, more often than not, will be very different from our idea. But that's what's beautiful about it. God's ideas, God's ways are higher than our ways. God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts. They're above our thoughts. He knows what will ultimately bring us that greatest satisfaction and fulfillment that we're seeking for. When we live our life like this, we find freedom and peace in our lives. God gives us that freedom from fears. We're no longer a slave to fear. We find peace and hope knowing that no matter what the outcome was or is, that God is still working all things for our greater good. It's only when we reach the top of our biggest mountain that we can look back and see all the valleys that brought us to the top and rest in the fact that failure is not the opposite of success. It's a part of success. And I want you to remember this. Failures are stepping stones to God's greatest success for you. Imagine if you could begin to view failures as stepping stones to God's greatest success for you. Imagine how that would transform your perspective and your view on your life each day going forward. Suddenly, failures wouldn't bring you down, but they would empower you because you know that they're leading you somewhere forward. You would know that these failures are leading you to something greater and bigger and beyond you. Imagine if you could view failure like that. Imagine if you could embrace that reality. How would that transform your life?